Not only is Castlevania Symphony of the Night a masterpiece of video game design, it's teeming with references to history, religion, literature, and folklore. This is the Annotated Symphony of the Night. Hello again. You may be wondering what we're doing in a place like a castle chapel. After all, this is a video game about a centuries-old vampire whom is constantly resurrected from the dead to fulfill a diabolical, satanic role as the ultimate evil, so your curiosity isn't unfounded. A castle in Europe like this one, though, commonly had chapels built into them long before the 18th century when this game takes place, making this a historically accurate location. That is, if this were actually Vlad III's castle. History has the Wallachian warlord connected to several separate Romanian castles, including Bran Castle between Transylvania and Wallachia, Poenari Castle in Mount Citetia, and Corvin or Hunyadi Castle in Hunedoara. Of the three, only Bran and Hunyadi had chapels, as Poenari was more of a fortress or citadel, and Vlad was a prisoner in Hunyadi for a time, not an official owner. History has proven through his own writings that author Bram Stoker had no knowledge of any of these places, though, and envisioned Castle Dracula from the novel as what we commonly see in a Castlevania game's intro, on an empty, ominous mountaintop. Still, if we're connecting the character to the man, it still makes sense that Vlad III would have a chapel in this castle, as he and his bloodline were connected to the chivalric Order of the Dragon, which, again, is where Dracula derives. This order of knights was founded to fight the enemies of Christianity, often cited as specifically the Ottoman Empire, so Vlad was a Catholic God-fearing Wallachian. He would also have to be a wealthy one for a chapel of this size, as they weren't exactly cheap to have built indoors at the time. As we make our way through it, you'll actually see that it's a fairly faithful recreation of a large chapel of the time, right down to the holy water font right here in the narthex. It also makes sense that this is called the Royal Chapel from an architectural standpoint too. The nave of castle chapels, the central aisle where followers were seated, were often split in two, the common folk being seated underneath, while the royalty and castle lords would be raised above them, not unlike a balcony. The nave of the Royal Chapel here is also connected eventually to the castle keep where Dracula's throne is found, which we'll see in a later episode. While we make our way up this giant staircase, it's worth pointing out that this is one of the first games in the Castlevania series to famously drop the staircase mechanic that was found in practically every other game in the franchise up to this point, other than exceptions like the Castlevania Adventure for Game Boy. Above us is a nice collection of items, but we can't get them yet without some relics found later. This enemy is the Bone Pillar, which is a common series foe that was originally from the first game on the NES. Like in most games of the franchise, killing the lower Bone Pillar will drop the top stacked one downward. It will rarely drop an anti-venom consumable or a ballroom mask, which is a piece of headgear that grants +2 to defense. Up here is the corner guard or slant guard in the Japanese version. Not a particularly challenging foe and more of a nuisance really. It drops a cutlass and a Damascus sword. The latter is named after the capital Assyria, of course, but also refers to the method of folding Damascus steel for weapon forging, a technique that is believed to have been lost to time. Because of this, Damascus swords have something of a mythic status about them, that they can cut through solid rock and never shatter, which is just a little bit far-fetched. You may not believe it, but this spike ball can be killed. It has its own level, hit points, and rare drops, even though it's not listed in the Librarian's Bestiary, and is technically part of the Bone Pillar as far as this game is concerned. Obviously, killing the lower Bone Pillar will free it to roll down the stairs and kill anything in its path, but if you're diligent enough to whittle away all 500 of its hit points for rare drops, you'll find an Iron Ball and the Axe Lord armor, one of only 2 places, of the latter of which can be found without using a code at the beginning of the game. The Chancel here is defended by the first of 3 different kinds of spectral swords that we'll encounter. It originated in Rondo of Blood. Oddly, this is the middle child as far as their respective strength is concerned, and we'll see the weaker one in the next episode. It can still be a challenging encounter at this point in the game, though. The Poltergeist swords it summons will grant some low-level experience when killed, and even drop a Takemitsu on occasion. The actual floating sword in the middle, though, will drop either a broadsword or a bastard sword. The The broadsword is known as the Kotzbalger in the Japanese version. These swords are primarily sidearms for pikemen and archers for when enemies got too close, and its broad blade and round point made it ideal for cutting and not stabbing. It was the signature weapon of the Landsknecht, a formidable German mercenary force around the 16th century. The bastard sword is commonly referred to as a hand-and-a-half sword, but this is a modern term that was coined in the late 19th century. This is a standard European longsword often used in late medieval combat, and there's some contention as to the technique of its use. Some historians contend that it was a one-handed weapon, while others see it as a Beidenhander, or two-handed sword, also often used by the Landsknecht. Of these two swords in the game, the bastard is the strongest, but they're just still basic weapons with no special attacks. Above the pulpit here is a pair of goggles that raise defense by 1 and intelligence by 4, making them superior eyewear than the sunglasses that we found earlier. This room is a great little touch. It's a booth made for the Catholic rite of confession, where a person would lay out their sins to a priest and then observe reconciliation. As you may have already noticed from an earlier video, Alucard can have a seat in many of the chairs in the game, and by doing so here, he's subject to 4 randomly generated effects. First, on the confessor's side, a priest in either blue or purple garb will hear his confession. If it's a blue priest, it may randomly drop wine, which was censored to grape juice in the North American version of the game. This is a reference to the Last Supper, where Christ transfigured wine into his blood and shared it amongst his apostles, which is symbolically still used to this day in Christian prayer services, alongside breaking and sharing of bread to represent his body. If it's a purple priest, though, the curtains will close, and Alucard may be impaled if he isn't careful. The other side of the booth can let Alucard play act as a priest hearing confessions as well. From this angle, a sinister woman in pale green garb will again try to stab him, though a woman in red will continue dishing out her sorrows until Alucard gets up to move. A 2016 article on the AV Club about this room went so far as to speculate that this might actually be the ghost of Alucard's mother, Lisa, finding a way to come to terms with loving a homicidal vampire, but really, who knows? It's linked below. Lastly about this room, there was dialogue recorded for the priest that states the sign of the cross, which is still found in the code of the game disc, but was left unused. You can hear it at website The Cutting Room Floor, also linked below. We're now moving outside of the chapel proper to a series of interconnected bell towers. Above us is the Black Crow, a close relation to previous games' Crow and Raven enemies, placed to perturb in complicated platforming sections as far back as the first Castlevania. It drops an aquamarine and a red bean bun. We're also dealing with a never-ending torrent of winged guards or flying skeletons in the Japanese version. These monsters originated in Dracula's Curse for the NES, and often fly in Medusa head-like wave patterns in other games. They're just minor annoyances here and drop the iron shield and javelins. This is our first encounter with the Hunting Girl, whose transparency effect is another product of the PlayStation hardware. The hitbox in this enemy is actually in the sword, not the spectral body that flashes on the screen, so that's what you should be attacking. This enemy in the Japanese version is called Nemesis, which is a goddess of retribution from Greek mythology that would exact revenge on mortals who succumb to hubris, or arrogance against the gods. The most famous story she's involved in was that of a hunter named Narcissus and his vanity. Upon observing his cruel behavior toward the people that loved him, Nemesis lured him to a pool where he fell in love with his own reflection and eventually died as he refused to look away at his own beauty. The term Hunting Girl is possibly a play on this story, as it also involved the invisible wood nymph Echo, whom also fell in love with him, was spurned and was so distraught that she spent the rest of her days wandering the woods until only the echo of her voice remained. The enemy drops a piece of cheesecake, which may be because we're looking at a mostly naked contour of a woman, not unlike a cheesecake or pinup photo. She also drops the Werebane sword, which is strong against enemies like werewolves, whom we'll see in the next video actually. It has a rapier-like stabbing effect with a fireball motion. This blue raven has the exact same stats as the black crow, but drops a zircon and pork bun. It's also less hostile than its counterpart. These narrow passageways are ideal spots for the bone halberd enemy in its long reach. Known as the skeleton spear in the Japanese version, the bestiary notes that it's also a naginata-wielding enemy, like the spear guard from the Outer Wall. It drops a javelin and ham and eggs, which, according to its in-game description, will not only restore hit points but also raise cholesterol. Better be careful. Here we have the boss of the area, the mythological hippogriff. These creatures have the bodies of horses, usually depicted as mares, and the head of an eagle. The earliest recorded mention of it was from classical Latin poet Virgil, but has been attributed to myths and stories as a steed for wandering knights and wizards, and has a close relation to the Greek god Apollo. It's something of a staple of modern fantasy literature.
Impressive. You're very strong.
What is it you want? You didn't come here to tell me that.
You're right. Do you know the name Richter Belmont?
Of the Belmont clan? Of course, but...
He disappeared about a year ago, and I'm sure he's here. If you see him, please let me know.
As you wish, my lady.
Thank you. So, you do know how to be a gentleman.
Before we move on, we have to take a second to discuss this room and the mural behind us. Now, nothing is explicitly stated in the game about the painting and what it represents, so let's just use what we know to find some possible meaning here. First, we've seen that the Royal Chapel is a very close representation of an actual church's individual sections, except for the sacristy, the room where the priest robes and prepares for Mass. If this were to be it, was the hippogriff the priest? Following that thread, Dracula states in the prologue that religion enslaves humanity. Therefore, having a chapel like this one in his evil castle makes a little bit more sense. This painting in the background with 6 winged skeletons slaughtering humans takes that metaphor to a rather extreme conclusion. The number of skeletons is also symbolic. The number 6 was considered holy and perfect. The Hebrew Star of David is 6 points, God created world in 6 days with humanity on that day, and even the yearly Seder dinner at Passover has 6 foods on the plate. However, much like something else in the Bible that was holy and perfect and ultimately corrupted and perverted, the number 666 is closely associated with the beast from the book of Revelation, which also, by extension, is associated with Satan. This comes up again here and there in the series. Dracula, as a final boss, for example, has 6,666 hit points in Harmony of Dissonance and Portrait of Ruin, and we'll see this number again ourselves in a few videos from now, denoting a hellish encounter in a somewhat more subtle way. Lastly, this painting may represent the opening of the 6th seal, also from the book of Revelation. This refers to a vision by St. John of Patmos about the coming apocalypse, the second coming of Christ, and the book or scroll that was bound by 7 seals, the opening of which had profound effects on humanity. With the opening of the 5th seal, survivors of the first 4 previous openings were clad in white robes to note their faithfulness to God and the martyrs that were slain for him. The 6th seal was the big stuff, though, where the sky went as black as sackcloth, as is happening in the painting, and great calamities fell into humankind. Really dark stuff. While we could have farmed one of these from the Sword Lord in the outer wall or the corner guard earlier in the video, here's a free Cutlass, which is a nice upgrade if we haven't already found something better. So here we have the Castle Keep, which houses the throne room seen earlier, but we won't be getting that far. In fact, this area has some nice teases to incentivize players to further explore the castle and come back to this location down the road, which is necessary to complete the game. The keep of any castle was usually a fortified tower for nobility that would be something of a last resort or final refuge if the castle would fall to an adversary. The keep of this and other games in the series share a recurring staircase leading to the throne room, which we saw in the first video and will again later. This weapon is the Tyrfing, and there's a lot to say about it. For the most part, it's a totally useless item for normal runs of the game. It actually drops Alucard's attack stat by 30 points, and is saddled with the Dark Elemental Affinity, which many enemies in the game are strong against. Since it really doesn't do much of anything unless you have a fairly powerful Alucard to play with, which at that point would have outclassed this sword several times over, its presence in the game at all is a bit of a mystery. Well, aside from acting as a handicap for high-level playthroughs, its location serves as a clue to what you'll be fighting with if you're about to finish the first part of the game, or maybe achieve the bad ending. The boss of the keep is one of only 2 enemies in the entire game that's weak to dark elemental attacks, which is basically this weapon's only use. It's slow to strike and has no special attack. It's also a cursed blade according to Norse mythology. It actually figures heavily into a myth known as the Tyrfing cycle that begins with a king, a grandson of Odin, forcing 2 dwarves to make him a blade that would never miss a stroke and that cuts through stone and iron as though it would through clothes. The dwarves, though, cursed the finished sword in revenge to both kill a man whenever it was drawn and bring about 3 unnamed evils. These evils involved other mythological figures that eventually became the King of the Goths, and whom shaped Norse mythology and history in profound ways. These flying annoyances are called flea riders. They originally appeared in the first Castlevania for the NES as they dropped flea men from up above to ambush you, but are thankfully one conjoined pain in this game. They drop hit point refilling turkey and some ham and eggs. In Japan, they're known as the Semler, which might be a reference to Johann Salomo Semler, a German church historian, biblical critic, and quote, father of German rationalism, whom died just a few years before this game takes place. Finally, here's the Leapstone relic, known in Japan as the Flight Stone. No matter what you call it though, it dramatically opens the game up for further exploration since granting the ability to do a double jump. We can also stomp on enemies with a downward kick by pressing down at the D-pad and the attack button. It's a weak attack, but is useful for bouncing off enemies. With this, a player can backtrack to previously explored locations to open up new routes, which is exactly what we're going to do next. Other than the obvious practical use out of the Leapstone, it has 2 cool footnotes. One is the flash of wings as Alucard uses the second jump in midair, which is easily visible. The second occurs if he were to be inflicted with the stone status. Instead of a normal immovable half-vampire, on rare occasion he'll become a giant gargoyle. As Dracula can take multiple forms, this is probably a glimpse into what Alucard's vampiric true nature might be. Let's take a short break in this warp room. You may have noticed that the statue in these rooms is the same other than the central piece which changes to denote the location that you've warped to. I'm not spoiling too much by saying that this is the closest warp to the end of the first part of the game, so the lion head may be significant for a few thematic reasons. First, the lion is often called the king of the jungle, and we're close to the master of this castle. Second, in getting back to the religious apocalypse we spoke about earlier, this might represent the Lion of Judah, the only being capable of opening the 7 seals, what would set up the lord of this castle as a false prophet. As the enemy that we'll find later winds up being a false final boss, it's a stretch, but it fits the symbolism. We have a little bit of time to kill, so let's talk about magic. From the outset of the game, Alucard can use various magic spells instead of simply wielding corporeal weapons. These use a chunk of the blue magic meter at the top of the screen, so they're very resource intensive early on, but can easily turn the tide of a difficult fight if properly used even once. They're activated using complex controller commands, not unlike playing a fighting game, and are easily stumbled upon through some experimentation, though we can purchase the moveset from the librarian. Even if you were to buy or fumble across them, though, they'll permanently be listed in the status screen for reference. Here's a quick breakdown of each spell. Dark Metamorphosis is a state that Alucard can go in that will heal him if he kills enemies that spill blood. Not all enemies do, though, so a player needs to be cognizant of which monsters are useful prey. Summon Spirit conjures a sort of homing missile toward enemies for minimal magic cost. Hellfire is the famous 3 fireball attack used by Dracula in most games of the series, as well as Alucard in his appearance in Castlevania 3 for the NES. This is a very versatile spell in that will give him a brief period of invincibility with a teleport beforehand, and can be altered to cast Dark Inferno if a player holds up on the controller during the teleport. Dracula uses this as well in the prologue fight with Richter. Tetris Spirit is a more powerful version of Summon Spirit, as it sends 4 ghosts after foes instead of 1. Soul Steal swipes hit points from enemies within the area of effect. As well as magic, why don't we talk about elemental damage as well? If you remember when I brought up the Holy Water, I mentioned that it deals sustained holy damage, and that it's just one of the many different added attack bonuses that Alucard can both dish out and take. They range from fire to ice to dark to poison, and you can tell what sort of elemental attack is taking effect by the myriad colors that both an enemy and Alucard will flash when it's used on them. Keep an eye out for when I grab certain weapons later on and what part of the rainbow those beatings represent. Fun fact, the US manual of the game mentions that elemental damage exists, but is simply a blurb about bonus damage. According to Andrew Pemrich, a commenter on one of the previous episodes, this is brought up in some detail in the full-color Japanese manual. Here we are back at the clock room, and it's time to open up that alternate path with the stopwatch that I mentioned in an earlier video. Simply using it unlocks the right statue, which leads us to the Alucard gear, which are weak replicas of the endgame weapons that we had equipped before Death stole them at the beginning of the game. In a lot of situations, it's downright suicidal to use them at this point going forward, but equipping all 3 items jumps Alucard's luck stat up by 30 points, which is useful for item farming and critical attack chances. Taro Hagihara and Koji Igarashi, the game's co-directors, reminisce in a strategy guide interview translated by Shmupulations that there was originally going to be a much better set of items in this room, with correspondingly more challenging ways to get in, like a difficult platforming sequence, or the stone statue only moving at a certain time of the day based on the PlayStation's internal clock. Once they decided on getting in with the double jump and the stopwatch, they, quote, quickly and lazily made up those crappy Alucard items. Up through the opening made by the left angel every 60 seconds takes us into our next location, which is Orlox's quarters. We won't spend too much time here in the next episode as we can't map much of it yet, so we'll also move Alucard's story along into the Colosseum as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.